Horror movie fans are among the most enthusiastic and generous of any genre. They want to see the best in just about any film, and will forgive a lot of bad if a horror flick serves up a few fun kills. But to the same token, there are those films which just have dud written all over them from the jump. And yet, once again proving that our preconceptions can only take us so far, these movies actually ended up being so much better than anyone expected. So I'm Ellie with What Culture here with horror movies that had no right to be this good. Thanksgiving. Would it have surprised a single person if Eli Roth's 16 years in the making feature adaptation of his fake trailer for a Thanksgiving-themed slasher film originated in the Quentin Tarantino-Robert Rodriguez double feature Grindhouse was a total bust? Pair the lengthy gestation time with Roth's general inconsistency as a filmmaker, and it was reasonable to anticipate mediocrity at best from Thanksgiving, especially with the film being quietly shot and released with little marketing fanfare. What a pleasant shock it was then for the movie to end up one of 2023's best reviewed horror films released by a major studio. A giddily self-aware seasonal slasher which delivered the bountiful gore fans of the trailer expected alongside a wealth of black comedy. Given that Roth's enthusiasm for the concept could have easily wavered over the years and morphed the project into a mere paycheck gig, it was truly unexpected to see an end result so well crafted and genuinely entertaining from start to finish. Dawn of the Dead. Those who were there at ground zero when Universal announced a remake of George A. Romero's zombie masterpiece Dawn of the Dead will remember just how skeptical, if not downright pissed off, fans of the original were. More to the point, giving such a hallowed property to a no-name music video director called Zack Snyder and a writer of junky trauma movies by the name of James Gunn? Ugh, this had disaster written all over it. But huge props to Snyder, whose bold directorial debut was a more than worthy reimagining of Romero's classic, which ably justified its own existence. Rather than rehash the original film beat for beat, Snyder and Gunn's retelling is a leaner, arguably meaner rendition of the same core concept, shedding the more overt satire of Romero's version, but doubling down on the deeply visceral hopelessness of its apocalyptic scenario. Girded by its manic energy and the efforts of a solid ensemble cast, Dawn of the Dead 04 is close to a cinematic miracle, a movie every card-carrying horror fan was dreading, and yet one which turned out to be a damn gift to them all. Host. When the film industry ground to a halt by the pandemic in early 2020, filmmakers had to get truly creative if they still wanted to make movies. And in the horror sphere, nobody took greater advantage of that opportunity than little-known director Rob Savage. Savage's Host, a horror film set entirely on a Zoom call in the midst of the pandemic, took full advantage of that specific moment in time to deliver a uniquely gut-wrenching depiction of a seemingly familiar seance-gone-wrong scenario. Despite its seemingly thrown-together nature, directed remotely by Savage with the cast carrying out their own camera and practical effects work, Host feels impressively holistic and motivated throughout, elevated considerably by the top-draw efforts of the mostly unknown ensemble. Host also benefits from a drum-tight 56-minute runtime, ensuring that it can't even begin to outstay its welcome. All the same, nobody could be blamed for having basement-low expectations for a not even feature-length, no-budget horror film produced from concept to delivery in just 3 months and randomly released on Shudder totally out of nowhere. Wrong Turn 2 Dead End. It's not unfair to say that expectations were basically through the Earth's core for Wrong Turn 2 Dead End, a straight-to-video follow-up to 2003's modest backwards slasher flick Wrong Turn, helmed by then-unknown filmmaker Joe Lynch. This had basically everything working against it, including a budget less than 1/3 of the theatrically released original, yet Lynch did perhaps the one thing nobody expected. He made Wrong Turn fun. Don't be mistaken, Wrong Turn 2 certainly doesn't leave fans wanting for outrageous gore, but it's also an unexpectedly funny film compared to its more serious-minded predecessor, taking satirical potshots at reality TV, yet never quite making the descent into nudge-nudge farce. Lynch didn't have a ton of money to work with, but passion and effort bleed from every frame of this movie, confirming that he tried his damnedest to make an entertaining sequel rather than a lazy, cynical cash-in. 4 increasingly terrible sequels and a not-bad reboot later, it remains the best of the series by a wide margin, in turn proving that not all straight-to-video sequels are created equal. The Empty Man. It's almost never a good sign when a movie spends years languishing on a studio's shelf. And so there wasn't much hope for The Empty Man, the directorial debut of David Fincher protege David Pryor. Pryor's supernatural horror was shot in the summer of 2017 before atrocious test screenings led Fox to halt its release until October 2020, where it was quietly dumped in cinemas with little marketing fuss. Initial reviews were heavily mixed, which combined with a D+ cinema score seemingly condemned it to obscurity. Yet, word of mouth among horror fans allowed it to enjoy a resurgence once it hit streaming a short while later, where it became something of a bona fide cult classic. And indeed, far from an overhyped film Twitter darling, The Empty Man is a beautifully shot, richly atmospheric horror with one of the most startling prologue sequences of any genre entry from the last few years. Given the studio's reaction to it, you'd be forgiven for writing it off as a worthless dud, yet it's anything but. Piranha 3D. Was anyone really in the market for a remake of Joe Dante's 1978 comedy horror film Piranha, and one in 3D no less? And yet, Alexandre Aja's shamelessly schlock-happy effort is in fact a deliriously entertaining romp which certainly one-ups the nudity and violence of its predecessor. Though most of the gory mayhem is saved for the movie's outrageous finale, this is a lot of fun from beginning to end, thanks to both its unrelentingly goofy tone and an evidently game cast, especially Jerry O'Connell, Kelly Brook and Ving Rhames. And if you saw the movie in 3D back in 2010, you'll surely recall just how much those in-your-face effects added to the knowingly campy experience. Even viewed today in 2D though, this is a considerably better directed film than many could have possibly anticipated, delivering firmly on the bloody promises of its title. The less said about 2012's lousy cash-in sequel though, the better. Paranormal Activity. Given that Paranormal Activity spent more than 2 years being tinkered with by Paramount following its initial 2007 festival premiere, it was easy to believe that this micro-budget found-footage film was basically a case of The Emperor's New Clothes. The pre-release buzz surrounding the film, where the studio labelled it as the scariest movie ever made, while insisting that audiences demand it be screened in their local cinema, left many suspicious that Paramount was basically using viral marketing to try and profit off a turkey they struggled to get out of post-production limbo. And while the film certainly isn't for everyone, it is a testament to what a skilled filmmaker can produce with relatively minimal resources, using negative space in the frame to basically let the audience's brain do most of the work, filling in the gaps and implying what can't actually be seen. If the inevitable spate of sequels soon enough drove the concept firmly into the ground, the original film was an inspired flash in the pan which wrung tremendous atmospheric mileage out of two people being terrorized by a mostly unseen entity in their home. Watcher. Psychological horror film Watcher is a fascinating example of a movie which benefited from a very happy accident. The narrative focuses on a woman who believes that a stranger who watches her from an apartment block across the street may be a serial killer terrorizing the city. During development, the story was set in New York City, but due to the pandemic making shooting in the United States financially unfeasible, the decision was made to film in Bucharest, Romania instead, and also shift the setting there. This ultimately added a whole new dimension to the film, as our protagonist Julia now has to deal with the isolation and anxiety of moving to an unfamiliar country where she doesn't speak the language, on top of the maybe serial killer scenario. And it's honestly tough to imagine Watcher any other way. The film would have almost definitely been less interesting with its original stateside setting. And so, while nobody's happy the pandemic happened, circumstances certainly allowed for Watcher to become a better film because of it. Ouija: Origin of Evil. 2014's Ouija remains one of the worst major studio horror films of the last decade, enough that nobody could muster much enthusiasm for prequel Ouija: Origin of Evil, even with a talented on-the-rise filmmaker by the name of Mike Flanagan serving as both writer and director. This was admittedly 2 years before Flanagan totally blew up with The Haunting of Hill House, and while it was reasonable to expect that this prequel would surpass the first film, that was really only because the bar was in hell. While far from Flanagan's finest work, Origin of Evil is a huge step up from its predecessor, and shares much of the DNA of his better, later projects, namely character-driven scares and technical mastery behind the camera. It's also headlined by 2 terrific performances from a duo of Flanagan's prominent future collaborators Elizabeth Reese and Lulu Wilson. Given that Universal could have easily hired any old hack to crank out a soulless sequel, as the original grossed over $100 million worldwide regardless of critical reception, it was a pleasant surprise that they actually sought out quality instead. Terrifier 2. Though the first Terrifier proved an easy success on its mere $35,000 budget, critical and audience opinion was widely divided, with many criticizing its threadbare plot, rough dialogue, and underdeveloped characters, but praising its creative gore effects and David Howard Thornton's performance as Art the Clown. Upfront expectations weren't exactly high for Terrifier 2 to be anything but more of the same. Though once its 138-minute runtime was announced, there was genuine concern it would turn out a horribly indulgent mess. And while Terrifier 2 absolutely could have used some trimming, it is for the most part a tectonic improvement over the first, from the superior screenplay and performances to the extreme gore that's sure to nauseate even the most well-trained of bloodhounds. Armed with just $250,000, filmmaker Damien Leone crafted a genuine slasher epic, and one which was rewarded with an impressive $15.7 million at the box office.
Scream 4, 2011. When it comes to pitch-perfect horror satire, it doesn't get any better than Wes Craven's original Scream trilogy. Not only did these films dissect and poke fun at the various horror tropes of the era, but the trilogy also delivered a genuinely enthralling slasher mystery. Over a decade after the trilogy ended, however, it was announced that Scream 4 would be hitting our screens, and horror fans unanimously sighed at the prospect. Horror cinema in the 2000s was dominated by lazy and terrible remakes, with the atrocity of 2010's A Nightmare on Elm Street still fresh in our minds. The concern was that Scream 4 would be another tasteless and needless revival of a horror classic. What we weren't expecting, though, was for Scream 4 to do what Scream did best, and lovingly break down contemporary horror tropes. And with Craven returning alongside the original cast, this was the revival the franchise needed. Moreover, there's plenty of grisly slasher fun to be had here too, alongside another fun mystery to solve about who's behind the mask this time. If you skipped Scream 4, now is just as good a time as any to check it out. Halloween 2, 1981. John Carpenter's 1978 genre-defining classic Halloween is regarded as one of the greatest horror films of all time. Unfortunately, like most horror franchises, the ensuing sequels got exponentially worse with each iteration. While the recent Halloween films have revitalized Michael Myers as a modern horror icon, horror fans sometimes forget that the original sequel is an excellent slasher flick. Directed by Rick Rosenthal in his feature debut, with Carpenter returning to write alongside Deborah Hill, the sequel picked up right where the first film left off. Laurie Strode is taken to hospital, Dr. Loomis is still on the hunt for the escaped killer, and Myers is still out for blood. While this film had a bigger budget to work with and amped up the gore significantly from its predecessor, the empty hospital setting nevertheless gave the sequel that same contained and claustrophobic atmosphere as Carpenter's film. Though Curtis doesn't have much to do throughout most of the picture, Michael is just as terrifying as before, as an unstoppable force of evil, and Pleasance once again steals every scene he's in. Best viewed straight after watching the original film, Halloween 2 is much better than you imagine. Hush, 2016. Released on Netflix without any sort of fanfare, Hush gave the impression of being an unremarkable straight-to-streaming horror flick that was intended to be buried at the bottom of Netflix's library. And while there are certainly dozens of stinkers released this way, Hush proved to be the exception. Our first clue that the film was good was that it was directed and co-written by Mike Flanagan. Though he was yet to go on to helm acclaimed series like The Haunting of Hill House and Midnight Mass, alongside the likes of hit films Dr. Sleep and Gerald's Game, Flanagan's previous work on Absentia and Oculus had started to garner him a reputation as a powerhouse in the genre. The premise is simple. Deaf author Maddie is trying to finish her novel when she becomes targeted by a masked intruder. From here, Hush descends into an edge-of-your-seat thrill ride in which she must try and stay one step ahead of her would-be killer. What makes Hush excellent is Flanagan's ability to keep the action grounded within reality, with smartly written characters who act believable within the given situation. Effective use of gore likewise helps rack up the tension in this underseen home invasion horror. Freaky, 2020. Best known for his light-hearted comedy persona, the idea of Vince Vaughn playing a serial killer had many scratching their heads when we saw that he was starring in horror comedy Freaky. A playful twist on the body swap format, this premise sees Vaughn's malicious murderer, known only as the Butcher, trade places with everyday teenager Millie after accidentally invoking a ritual. The opening scene, with its bone-crunchingly violent kills and self-aware nods to the slasher genre, let viewers know they're in for a fun ride right from the start. But it's not until the body swapping begins begins that this film, directed by Happy Death Day's Christopher Landon, comes into its own. Proving all the doubters wrong, Vaughn is the main highlight here. His comedic prowess is on full display as he portrays an awkward teenage girl, and anyone who saw him in Brawl in Cell Block 99 will be familiar with how intimidating of an on-screen presence he can be. In Freaky, Vaughn leans into both these personas without missing a single beat. While this film does admittedly fall into familiar cliches and tropes, the faults don't dampen any of the slasher goodness in this endlessly entertaining outing. Fear Street Part 2, 1978, 2021. Netflix's adaptation of R.L. Stine's Fear Street series was marketed as Netflix's horror event of the summer, a trilogy of terror anchoring around a small town with a history of gruesome massacres and witchy secrets made for a fantastic premise for a modern slasher. However, an exposition-heavy script with more teen drama than slasher goodness got the series off to a rocky start. Expectations for Part 2 were subsequently diminished, but to our delight, the follow-up was superior in all aspects. Jumping back in time to the eponymous year and to a summer camp about to see a massacre, and now the series was free of all its obligatory setup, the flick was able to indulge in the slasher tropes we were hoping for. Although it took some time for the butchery to commence, this time was spent getting to know the characters, especially sisters played by Sadie Sink and Emily Rudd, meaning that when the blood started to spill, we were deeply invested in who'd get out alive. The witchy twist likewise gave the summer camp carnage an intriguing new spin, whilst simultaneously building upon the overarching story in meaningful ways. This was all we were hoping for and more from this trilogy. Wes Craven's New Nightmare, 1994. Despite going a tad off the rails in its 5th and 6th installments, the Nightmare on Elm Street series, especially the first 2 films, are regarded as definitive entries in the slasher genre. Within the series though, Wes Craven's New Nightmare is seen as the odd one out for being so different to what came before. Unlike the others, this flick took things in a wildly new direction. Set within the real world, the plot sees returning star Heather Langenkamp asked to appear in a new Nightmare on Elm Street production, which will be helmed by Wes Craven, who returns to the director's chair for this film. However, an otherworldly presence known as The Entity, which has taken the form of Freddy Krueger, once again played by Robert Englund, begins to wreak havoc on Langenkamp and the production. The meta-commentary approach New Nightmare takes is so far removed from the rest of the series that it's understandable fans were hesitant to dive in. Still, this new angle was exactly what the series needed. Not only does the reality-bending script bring intriguing new ideas to the well-worn Nightmare formula, but the film is brimming with stunning and imaginative visuals throughout. Child's Play, 2019. While there are occasional exceptions to this rule, horror remakes tend to have a poor track record when it comes to their quality. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Poltergeist, and The Mummy are just some of the atrocities responsible for this reputation. Therefore, when a remake of Child's Play was announced for 2019, hopes weren't exactly high. What was especially worrying about this remake was that Don Mancini's original franchise was still going strong at the time. 2 recent sequels were met by adoration from fans, and a TV series released in 2021 was also in the works. This remake consequently felt entirely unnecessary. Despite being detached from the original series, this Child's Play turned out to be more fun than anyone expected. Switching the possession angle of the original, this Chucky, voiced by a charismatic Mark Hamill, who's a commendable stand-in for Brad Dourif, is a malfunctioning high-tech toy that gets an appetite for violence. More than a modernization of the classic slasher, the 2019 Child's Play became a razor-sharp satire on consumerism and our over-reliance on technology. This slasher knew exactly what it was. It never took itself too seriously and delivered on the gruesome gore. Slacks, 2021. If done right, a horror film can make anything scary. Jaws made us terrified of going swimming, Cujo ensured we kept distance from strange dogs, and J-Horror X turned hair into a malevolent force. However, one of the strangest things to get the horror treatment was a pair of jeans in Elsa Keffart's insane horror comedy Slacks. Released on Shudder, the plot saw optimistic youngster Libby get a new job at a very exclusive clothing store that's about to release a new line of jeans. The company promote themselves as ethically moral to the public. However, this couldn't be further from the truth. The fashion house has been exploiting workers in sweatshops and working them to death. In a ridiculous yet poignant metaphor, the souls of those workers have haunted these jeans and are out for revenge against the influencers and fashionistas. In less capable hands, Slacks could easily have been another forgettable schlocky gimmick, but thanks to its snappy writing, wickedly cool presentation, and wild sense of humor, Keffart's fashionably gruesome flick proved to be a delightfully entertaining time. Though outlandishly silly at times, Slaxx knew how to use its absurd premise to articulate a surprisingly effective humanitarian message. Slumber Party Massacre, 2021. When it comes to definitive slashers, you don't get much grislier or exploitative than 1982 cult classic The Slumber Party Massacre. The thought of remaking this video alone would be enough for dedicated horror fans to turn up their noses in disdain. However, if this list has taught us anything, it's never to judge a slasher flick by its cover. Helmed by Danishka Esterhazy, the filmmaker behind The Banana Splits, another surprisingly good slasher, this reimagining of the original once again sees a group of scantily clad teenagers fall prey to driller killer Russ Thorn, this time played by Rob Van Vuren. More than just a retreading of the blood-spattered gore and subversive feminist angle of its predecessor, this sleepover had some surprises of its own. Moving the carnage from the suburbs to a remote lakeside cabin, this version puts the feminist core of its predecessor front and center. These women are looking to put an end to Russ's rampage, and they'll stop at nothing to do so. The result is a wickedly self-aware and devilishly gory time. Currently sitting at a perfect score on Rotten Tomatoes, Slumber Party Massacre is much better than you'd expect.
Night of the Living Dead, 1990. Kicking things off with a movie that many might have written off as doomed simply by association, Night of the Living Dead in 1990 is way better than it has any right to be. Unfortunately, George A. Romero's Dead series has seen an overwhelming amount of remakes and spiritual successes that have besmirched its good name. But Night of the Living Dead in 1990 was not capitalized on by a bunch of chances, no. This actually had involvement from Romero himself, who drafted in his longtime filmmaking partner Tom Savini to direct. And while undeniably a special effects maestro, was not guaranteed to succeed in this other field. Savini puts in a solid effort, mostly selling the threat of these updated zombies, while the changes to Barbara's character in particular make her much more compelling than her original counterpart, with an actual input in the story this time around. One Cut of the Dead. Okay, so, One Cut of the Dead should not work and is in a way technically not even really a zombie movie. That's because what starts out as a seemingly low-budget horror movie about a filmmaking crew that gets attacked by real zombies while they're making a fake zombie film ultimately reveals itself to have a hidden third layer. That's because it then reveals that what we're actually watching is really a filmmaking team making a movie about a zombie apocalypse that occurs while a movie team is filming a movie about a zombie apocalypse. Still with me? Well, with a structure like that, one cut has to be executed, ironically if you've seen the flick yourself, perfectly in order to maximize the impact of its twists. One thing's for sure, we won't get a movie like One Cut of the Dead again anytime soon. Anna and the Apocalypse. A Christmas musical set in Scotland during a zombie apocalypse. Yeah, it's no surprise that Anna and the Apocalypse was a hard sell for many horror fans, hell, myself included. Even when the trailer dropped, it was easy to write this off as a corny genre experiment without the horror chops or catchy hooks to succeed in either of the genres that it was blending. With a set of likable characters, mainly teenagers on the cusp of graduation, and a surprisingly strong sense of horror running through it, the movie remains compelling for its runtime. The songs are charming, the stakes are surprisingly high, and while it's not a masterpiece by any means, it is a quintessential pick for a list like this, because the disparate parts have no right being this good, but when brought together like this, they absolutely are. The Battery. The Battery, admittedly, is a movie I have only seen once back when it came out in 2012, but it's testament to its impact that I genuinely still regularly think about it over a decade later. Which is kinda crazy considering we've had so many bigger and more high-profile zombie films since then. What makes that even better as well is that The Battery is a passion project through and through. A micro-budget horror made for a mere $6,000 that sees two friends trying to survive on the road during a zombie apocalypse. With a budget like that, don't expect heart-stopping action and big set pieces, but The Battery does spend its money wisely, keeping the zombie threat real while more importantly showing the effect it's having on our two characters. And this is a character study through and through, showing the highs and lows, let's face it, mostly lows, but I was trying to be kind, of their growing friction as they try to navigate this impossible scenario. With a unique and harrowing final reel, The Battery is proof that as long as you've got an interesting idea and intriguing characters, anyone can make a good zombie movie. Dead Snow. Norwegian horror Dead Snow could have been one of those movies that has a great premise, yes, that gets people talking at parties, but doesn't actually result in an amazing full 90 minutes of cinema. Following a group of friends who cozy up in a cabin only to accidentally find themselves on the receiving end of the wrath of a group of Nazi zombies, this comedy horror thankfully has the chops to live up to its mad premise. Featuring chainsaws, heavy weaponry, and plenty of inventive death scenes, Dead Snow is far from a shameless cash-in on the Nazi zombies trend popularized by Call of Duty in the late 2000s and early 2010s. No, there's real filmmaking craft on display here, almost as if the filmmakers themselves are trying to prove any naysayers wrong who may think this is just a corny one-trick pony. It might not be Shakespeare, but hey, to my knowledge, he never made a good zombie story that I know of. But what Dead Snow lacks in substance, it more than makes up for in pure cacophonous fun, all wrapped in the B-movie thrills of blood, guts, and ultraviolence. Maggie. 2015's Maggie begins with an already turned victim. After his daughter Maggie is infected with the zombie virus, it's up to Wade, played by freaking Arnold Schwarzenegger, to find a way to save her. A horror drama, Maggie looks at all the heartbreaking ways in which a zombie apocalypse could unite and tear a family apart. Now, the point of casting Schwarzenegger in the role wasn't to trade on his action movie pedigree, but rather to subvert expectations. Instead, casting him in a more human, emotion-driven role as a desperate father. That in itself is a risk, as was hiring first-time movie director Henry Hobson to guide this star. And yet, somehow, these strange elements come together for a harrowing and poignant tale. It's not quite a Logan or a Pig, but it's way better than it could have been. Shaun of the Dead. Arriving in cinemas the same year as Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, you could have been forgiven, and many were, for thinking that Shaun of the Dead was merely a cynical attempt to send up what was set to be one of the decade's most popular zombie flicks. But Edgar Wright's rom-com transcends any prejudgment and proved the big screen talent that had been percolating through Edgar Wright while he worked away on a string of cult classic comedy TV shows. You probably know of the story by now. Likeable loser Shaun tries to shield his loved ones from a zombie apocalypse by hiding in a pub that may or may not have a functioning gun above the bar. Shaun of the Dead is such a horror staple today to ever think of it as a risk, or something that people were initially skeptical of, but it's surprising just how little faith people had in this flick. Resident Evil. Rarely do the phrases video game adaptation and good movie sit comfortably together. You've got director Paul W.S. Anderson at the helm, a man with a spotty track record to say the least, a story that's only loosely based on the video games with none of the iconic characters from the game, a way more pronounced action focus, a dodgy CGI killer AI, and a moment where our hero Matrix-style bounces off a wall and kicks a zombie dog in the head. But it's actually kind of because of these elements, not in spite of them, that the original Resident Evil remains a rollicking good time. Yeah, it won't satisfy if you're looking for an authentic adaptation of the games, but as its own beast, it does bring the scares, the early 2000s sheen, a kick-ass hero in Milla Jovovich's Alice, and an effective secret laboratory setting that keeps the action interesting. Planet Terror. B-movie passion project reminiscent of grindhouse exploitation cinema is the kind of phrase that makes film financiers wet the bed, and yet that's precisely what Robert Rodriguez managed to push through production back in 2007. Guided by the overwhelming popularity of collaborator Quentin Tarantino, who himself directed Death Proof, this film's double feature companion piece, Rodriguez was able to helm and release a flick that in other circumstances would never have seen the light of day. Especially at the time, where watered-down studio-mandated horror was king, nothing about this kitschy film, even though it was underscored by a formidable cast, including Rose McGowan, Michael Biehn, and Josh Brolin, should have worked, never mind being this good. This is a flick that turns everything up to 11, including the grain on the picture, by the way. You've got machine gun legs, you got priests with shotguns, melting faces, exploding heads, you name it, Planet Terror probably has it. It's grainy, it's gory, and it's one hell of a wild ride that simply should not exist.
The Exorcist 3. How many times have we seen a phenomenal original movie spawn multiple dour, dire sequels? Far too many to count. In the case of The Exorcist, that's a legendary piece of horror cinema, or cinema period to be fair, that has been followed by 4 pretty darn dreadful entries in what's now clearly a franchise. Away from the aforementioned 4 stinkers though, and there's a genuine diamond in the rough in the shape of The Exorcist 3. Released in 1990, 17 years after The Exorcist and 13 years after The Exorcist II: The Heretic, this William Peter Blatty-helmed picture is way, way better than anyone could have hoped. After the 1973 first film, The Heretic was such a massive disappointment. So by the time The Exorcist III rolled around so many years later, expectation was extremely low for this threequel. Moving away from the outright horror associated with the series by this point, this third film takes a rather different approach to its tale by adding in layers of a classic mystery or whodunit affair, as George C. Scott's Lieutenant Kinderman attempts to solve a case that seems to have plentiful ties to the events which troubled Reagan McNeil and Father Karras back in 1973. The Exorcist III is just as much a detective thriller as it is a horror movie, and the end result is something truly spectacular. Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. To some, the Friday the 13th franchise should have come to an end after 1984's The Final Chapter. After all, that was the movie that actually did the unthinkable and killed off Jason Voorhees. While the following years A New Beginning would reveal a copycat killer at its core, that being myth paramedic Roy Burns of course, 86 went and brought Jason back into the fold. To do so, the now adult Tommy Jarvis heads to Voorhees' grave to check the brute is still dead. Clearly, Tommy didn't take into account the terrible weather that would result in Jason being struck by lightning and reanimated. So why did Part 6 Jason Lives have no right to be as decent as it was? Well, it basically took a giant dump on the previous 2 entries in the franchise, walking back the concept of the series killer being dead, bringing him back in such a bonkers way, and served up a movie that rehashed the tired tropes, as in Jason murdering generic pretty young things just because, that had caused the franchise to become stale. Still, thanks to Tom Matthews' memorable turn as Tommy, a slew of brilliantly gory kills, and some great one-liners, you have a film that's one of the very best, if not the best, outing for this franchise in its 11-picture plus 1 crossover run to date. Annabelle Comes Home. The Annabelle of the wider Conjuring franchise is a fascinating figure. Much hyped as being a key part of James Wan's The Conjuring, this terrifying little turd was ultimately a footnote in that picture. So when horror hounds finally got to see more of Annabelle in her own self-titled 2014 movie, anticipation was high to see this creepy doll fully in the spotlight. Unfortunately, this film was a total stinker. Still, maybe Annabelle Creation could do the sinister presence justice, right? Wrong, for that was just as bad, if not worse, than its predecessor. By the time of Annabelle Comes Home in 2019, the bloom was off the rose, and nobody particularly cared about revisiting a character whose interest peaked 6 years prior. For those who did give Comes Home a chance, they were rewarded with a surprisingly good movie that gave audiences the sinister Annabelle in the Warrens' family home. This is what we were teased with back in The Conjuring, and this threequel ticks plentiful terrifying boxes as the titular doll causes chaos for young Judy Warren while her parents are out of town. It's not just Annabelle who shines here, mind, for McKenna Grace's Judy, her babysitter, and the sitter's pal are tormented by other demented apparitions, such as a Coins for Eyes ferryman, a pseudo-werewolf, and a possessed future-predicting TV set. Curse of Chucky. When Curse of Chucky was first announced, the vast majority of horror fans rolled their eyes at what was billed as starting from scratch with a standalone tale that ignored everything seen previously in the Child's Play franchise. By this point, not only had Chucky long become an icon of the genre, but audiences had also developed a fondness for Charles Lee Ray's bride, Tiffany, and their offspring, Glenn/Glenda. To hear that all of this was being thrown out of the window as the franchise recalibrated after 5 films, that had many shaking their head at the prospect of starting an entirely new canon for everyone's favourite good guy doll. Gone were the battle-worn stitches and scars of Chucky, and instead a fresh new good guy arrives at the door of Nika and her family. While this doll starts to covertly slice its way through the family home, this is every inch a complete restart for the property. That is, of course, until it's revealed that Curse is both a do-over and a sequel, complete with appearances from franchise favourites Tiffany/Jennifer Tilly and Andy Barclay. In Curse of Chucky, we have a film which exemplifies how to breathe fresh life into a series while still being respectful to what has come before. And for that, writer-director Don Mancini deserves huge credit. Final Destination 5. After 4 previous pictures, the Final Destination franchise returned in 2011 for yet another outing, which was very much presented as the same old of an opening act catastrophe being averted and death then hunting down those who escaped said disaster. For the most part, that's exactly what we got, with all of the regular Final Destination tropes being ticked off across the majority of this 5th entry's 92-minute runtime. Sure, there's nothing particularly wrong with the familiar Final Destination narrative, and it's always guaranteed to have you on the edge of your seat for its fake-outs, but after 5 films, that basic concept can start to feel a smidge stale. That's where Final Destination 5 came through, and came through big, by delivering a twist ending that elevated the movie from forgettable to memorable. That twist ending, of course, is that the final few minutes of Final Destination 5 revealed that this sequel was really a prequel, as showcased by 2 of our survivors getting on the same flight that exploded during the start of the very first Final Destination picture. Paranormal Activity 3. By their very nature, sequels tend to operate under a law of diminishing returns. These follow-ups exist because an initial idea proved to be successful, and thus that concept is expanded on and revisited in future films, usually in a way that sees that base kernel of the franchise become less special. With the Paranormal Activity series, the second film very much fits in with the above logic. The original movie was a belter which caught the imagination of horror hounds across the globe and reinvigorated the long stagnant found footage subgenre, and the second Paranormal Activity offering was decent but nowhere near as good as its predecessor. Traditionally, Paranormal Activity 3 would have been worse than Paranormal Activity 2 and would have been followed by more sequels that got progressively worse with each passing entry. Surprisingly, this threequel proved to be a fantastic, harrowing effort, which managed to equal the quality and terror of the 2007 original. Plot-wise, directors Henry Joost and Raoul Schulman spotlight the younger days of sisters Katie and Christy, the focus of Paranormal Activity and Paranormal Activity 2 respectively, and explore their first interactions with the demonic presence that's tormented them in adulthood. The scares, the ominous sense of dread, and the inventive ways of framing this story make for a thoroughly disturbing watch. Evil Dead 2. The biggest reason why Evil Dead 2 should be a stinker of a movie on paper is because many view the film to actually be a loose remake of the first Evil Dead picture. For decades, the debate has ravaged on amongst horror hounds as to whether Evil Dead 2 is a sequel or a remake. Even franchise star Bruce Campbell isn't entirely sure on this matter, with him instead labelling the film a requel during a 2016 interview with Bay at the Moon Productions. Given how much of Evil Dead 2 tells a story extremely close to the one seen in The Evil Dead, that alone should have meant that the film wouldn't be all that well received by fans. Added to that, this 1987 offering opted to go in a far more slapstick direction than its chilling, terrifying predecessor. So here you have a sequel that rehashes several pivotal parts of the original movie and that strips away some of the balls-to-the-wall scares in favour of a more comedic approach to its antics. Gloriously, this all comes together to work majestically and truly set the tone for what the greater Evil Dead franchise would become synonymous with. Dawn of the Dead. George A. Romero was an utter genius. This is the person who popularized the concept of ghouls and who crafted some of the greatest horror films in history. The reason why Romero's Dawn of the Dead features on a list of movies that didn't have any right to be as good as they are is that the filmmaker somehow managed to top another all-time classic, that being 1968's Night of the Living Dead, with this 78 picture. Night of the Living Dead revolutionized horror and cinema period, and stands as one of the greats of the genre. So by traditional film logic, that initial picture should never be topped by whatever sequels were to follow it. Completely disregarding this logic, Romero somehow went and bettered Night with the mesmerizing social commentary charged Dawn a decade later. With the ghouls of Night having now spread across the United States, Dawn of the Dead finds a group of survivors who seek shelter in a shopping mall. It's terrifying, it's humorous, it's satirical, and it's forever engaging across the film's 2-hour runtime. For George A. Romero to follow an iconic movie with an even more iconic sequel, well, that's just absolutely taking the piss in the best possible way.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. There were so many things that could have caused the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 to be rejected by fans of Tobe Hooper's 1974 classic. Following that iconic industry changer was always going to be an uphill battle. Plus, it was 12 years since the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Tobe Hooper boldly delivered a sequel that was vastly different tonally to what had come before. With TCM 2, that film was laced with black comedy and a sense of playfulness. And as part of that playfulness, Leatherface and his pops are joined by Chop Top, played brilliantly by genre fave Bill Moseley. And elsewhere, there's fresh protagonists in the shape of Dennis Hopper's Lefty Enright, the uncle of the original film Sally and Franklin, and Caroline Williams' radio DJ Stretch. It may have received a somewhat mixed response upon its initial release, but the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 nowadays thankfully gets a lot more love. Dead Snow 2, Red vs. Dead. Tommy Virkola's Dead Snow won a whole host of plaudits, with the humour, heart and heaps of gore striking a chord with many. Nazi zombies attacking in the snowy Norwegian hills, that's certainly quite the unique premise. And it was one that was unique enough to pull off once, but surely it couldn't be replicated. Well, Dead Snow 2 Red vs. Dead not only replicated that 2009 movie, but managed to better it. As his sequel opens, original survivor Martin has a zombie arm attached to him that gives him the ability to summon the undead for his own means, yes. And that comes in extremely handy, of course, when he and his new zombie squad pals have to face the wrath of Herzog, who is, of course, one of the former right-hand men of Adolf Hitler. Much like the first film, Dead Snow 2 is often beautiful, with the crisp scenery popping from the screen, and also being useful in showcasing elaborate sequences of bloodshed and brutality. Red blood, white snow, perfect mix. Dead Snow is an absolutely bonkers brilliant movie, and Dead Snow 2 Red vs. Dead is that and then some. Wrong Turn 2021. The first Wrong Turn was solid, the first sequel was okay, but the rest, yeah, it's a bit of a slog for those who stuck around to watch Left 4 Dead, Bloody Beginnings, Bloodlines, and of course Last Resort. So by 2021, there was minimal interest in yet another outing for a franchise which, truthfully, had become old hat just by the second film. Even more concerning, the 2021 film, simply titled Wrong Turn, was a second reboot for the franchise, and words like reboot, remake, and reimagining, they put a cold shiver down the spine. In a development nobody saw coming, the latest Wrong Turn movie was actually pretty darn good, pulling back on the gratuitous gore of the franchise, plus removing Three Fingers, Sawtooth and One Eye. The result was a more stylish film that takes its time with its terror. Rather than the mutated cannibals of prior movies, the bad guys of this picture are some primitive humans who live in their foundation community out in the woods, all headed up by the ever-great Bill Sage. Always good to see you, Bill. That's not to say that Wrong Turn 2021 doesn't have some gnarly moments, of course, as there is plenty of twisted brutality when it is called for. Amityville 2, The Possession. As of now, there are a staggering 45 movies that carry the Amityville name. Some of these feature possessed clocks and mirrors from the old Amityville house, others take things to actual space, and one even centers on a sinister sex toy. Yes, it really does. Of all of these films, the very best could well be 1982's Amityville 2, The Possession, which is technically a prequel that takes place before the Lutz family moved into the infamous house 1 year after the DeFeo family massacre. Here, the DeFeo name is switched out for the Montellis, led by the late great Burt Young as family patriarch Anthony, who rules with an iron fist and is worryingly eager to physically assault his wife, children, and even threatens a priest. While Young's character is a proper scumbag though, it's the family's oldest child, Sonny, who ends up taking center stage, as the house possesses him to do its nefarious bidding. Granted, it's a smidge cheesy in places, very much a product of its time, but Damiano Damiani's Amityville 2, The Possession is a fantastic, creepy as all hell picture that descends into absolute chaos by the end. Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. Halloween took the slasher subgenre to a whole other level, and Halloween 2, that remains one of the most underrated sequels in horror history. Of course, these movies also introduced us to 3 all-timer characters in Michael Myers, Laurie Strode, and the crazy, erratic, magnificent Dr. Samuel Loomis. So it was quite the curveball for the third Halloween movie to leave Haddonfield, the Shape, Laurie, and Loomis in its rearview mirror, and that surprise direction was reflected in the mixed response to the movie at the time of its 1982 release. Halloween 3 Season of the Witch was intended to take the franchise in an anthology route, each subsequent new movie serving as a standalone picture not tethered to other entries in the series. For Halloween 3, the focus switched to the mysterious Silver Shamrock Company and their must-have Halloween masks, which just so happen to turn people's minds to literal mush. We're talking like maggots, snakes, all sorts of stuff. Gnarly. Desperate to stop this scheme, it's Tom Atkins, Dan Chalice, and Stacey Nelkins, Ellie Grimbridge on a quest to put pay to Silver Shamrock Hitchcock's plans. While some struggle with the concept of a Michael-less Halloween picture, Season of the Witch is a stunning slice of sci-fi horror that thankfully seems to be getting more appreciated in more recent years. Hellraiser 2022. The Hellraiser series is one full of far more stinkers than it is classics, with the 11-film franchise one condemned to straight-to-DVD releases after just its 4th movie. While it didn't get a theatrical release, last year's soft reboot of the franchise was far better than anyone was expecting. Long had fans been burned by dumpster fires such as Hellraiser Revelations, Hellraiser Hellseeker, and Hellraiser Hellworld, and thus anticipation was low here. Bringing a welcome lick of fresh paint to the stagnant series though, David Bruckner's Hellraiser features a mesmerizing Jamie Clayton as the priest, the leader of the Cenobites. Of course, some bemoaned Hellraiser for gender-swapping Pinhead, but that was a stupid argument in the first place. And those naysayers were looking rather daft when Clayton absolutely knocked it out of the park. Being immediately released to streaming platforms didn't really help the 2022 Hellraiser, yet this film stands as the finest entry in the franchise, probably since Hellbound Hellraiser 2 all the way back in 1988. Saw X. Given how the franchise hadn't been truly great for over a decade, few expected much from Saw X. And to the surprise of many though, Saw X is actually one of the better installments in the entire 20 years of the Saw franchise, and it manages to do that while taking a slightly different approach to prior Saw films. A prequel that has a lot more heart than one might expect, and obviously plenty of garish traps and bloodshed. Here we find a John Kramer dealing with the stark reality of only having months to live due to his brain cancer diagnosis. Set between Saws 1 and 2, and with Amanda Young back as his apprentice, John Kramer is afforded the hope of a miraculous recovery due to a Norwegian treatment that somehow cured some of his fellow cancer patients. It would feel a little harsh to go into any further plot details, but the end result is an extremely thoughtful, delicate entry in a franchise that eventually just became synonymous with nothing more than the standard trappings of the torture porn subgenre. Psycho 2. Much like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, 1983's Psycho 2 faced so many problems due to what it had to live up to, and because of the sheer amount of time that had passed since its predecessor. Whereas the gap between the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 was 12 years, it was a staggering 23 years between Psycho and Psycho 2, only adding further to the pressure of attempting to follow up on Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 masterpiece. Clearly, it would be impossible to make a movie as flawless as Psycho, but Psycho 2 manages to provide a great update on Norman Bates. With Anthony Perkins back in the saddle, we pick things up with Norman as he's freed from a mental asylum, just as a new batch of murders take place in and around the Bates Motel, showing a wide variety of emotions in an exquisite performance. Perkins' Norman is genuinely unsure whether his mother persona is responsible for all of this bloodshed, or whether something else entirely is at play. Psycho 2 brilliantly plays with the formula of the first movie to create a gripping mystery that makes the 23-year wait all very much worth it. Evil Dead Rise. When looking at the greatest franchises in horror, Evil Dead is the most consistent. The world of the Deadites had served up an excellent trilogy, a fantastic reboot, and a bloody brilliant TV series. And some pretty badass video games while we're at it as well. While there was extreme trepidation surrounding Fede Alvarez's 2013 Evil Dead, that trepidation was even more prevalent for Lee Cronin's Evil Dead Rise. With no Ashley J. Williams in sight, and with the familiar cabin in the woods setting removed, Rise seemed doomed once it was announced that it'd be getting a quiet release on HBO Max rather than a full theatrical release. Positive early screenings though, that did mean that Evil Dead Rise got a very short US cinema run, but the film was available to stream mere weeks after that run. But man, what a devilish delight of a movie Rise proved to be. Did anybody miss Ash? Nope. Did anybody miss the woods? Nope. Instead, Lee Cronin delivered a claustrophobic, chilling slice of horror as the action switched to a rundown high-rise building, with Alyssa Sutherland on particularly disturbing form as Ellie, a mother who falls under the spell of the Deadites.